Okay, so today we're going to dive into something pretty amazing.
Yeah.
The story of us humans and our genes.
It's a long one.
Oh, it is. Millions of years long.
Exactly. A real deep dive.
That's kind of the point, right? We've got all this research, fascinating stuff that really digs into how our DNA, like literally our genetic code,
Our blueprint.
our blueprint, has shaped, how humans evolved. And what's even cooler is how the big events, the massive shifts in history, have actually changed our genes.
It's a two-way street, It's not just genes making us, but us making our genes.
I like that, a two-way street.
Millions of years of conversation, back and forth.
Our mission today, should we choose to accept it, is to connect all those dots, to really understand that conversation,
And what a conversation it's been.
Okay, so let's rewind the tape all the way back, like way, way back.
Like time machine back?
Exactly, to Africa, somewhere between 6 and 8 million years ago.
Deep time.
Deep time, yeah. This is where our family tree, so to speak, branches off from chimpanzees and gorillas.
Right, our last common ancestor.
Right, we're all primates, but this is where we start to become, well, us.
And it wasn't a sudden thing.
No, not like a light switch.
More like, think of it as a really long, slow fade.
Okay, a gradual transformation taking, roughly 6 million years?
About that, yeah. 6 million years of tiny changes adding up.
So what was one of the first big changes, like a really crucial step in becoming human?
Walking. Walking on two legs.
Bipedalism.
Exactly, becoming bipedal.
Yeah.
That started over 4 million years ago.
Wow, that's got to be one of the most defining things about being human, right? I mean, walking upright.
It really is. I mean,
Yeah.
think about it. It frees up your hands.
True.
There are a bunch of theories about why it happened.
Yeah.
One idea is that standing up let us reach food higher up in trees.
Makes sense. Got to eat.
Exactly. The postural feeding hypothesis, they call it. Then there's the savanna theory, the idea that being upright gave us a better view out on the open grasslands.
Like to see predators or prey.
Exactly. Better awareness of your surroundings. And then there's the provisioning model, which suggests that walking on two legs freed up our hands to carry things like food or tools back to our families. And,
So basically multitasking.
yeah, kind of. It's probably not just one reason, though,
A combination of factors.
Right, different pressures all pushing in the same direction. And that's how evolution often works.
Okay, but to walk upright, our bodies had to change. It wasn't just a matter of deciding to walk differently.
Oh, absolutely. Our
Yeah.
skeletons had to undergo some major renovations, you could say.
Like a full body makeover.
You got it. The foramen magnum, that's the hole at the base of your skull where your spinal cord connects to your brain.
Yeah.
It had a shift position. It moved more underneath the skull, which helps with balance when you're standing upright.
Oh, interesting.
And our spines, they developed an S-shaped curve. It acts like a shock absorber.
Ah, makes sense.
Our pelvis, too, it became shorter and broader, better for supporting an upright posture.
So like a sturdier base.
Exactly. And our legs, obviously, they got longer. And the angle of our knees, that changed, too, the valgus angle. It makes walking more efficient.
So it's like everything shifted.
A total redesign from head to toe.
Now, this is where things get really interesting for me, and it's a little bit mind-blowing. So one of the research papers mentions this potential genetic change, something called an ALU element, that might have influenced this whole walking thing.
Yeah, the ALU elements, they're these little bits of DNA that can jump around in the genome.
Jump around.
They can copy and paste themselves into different spots.
So they're like genetic nomads.
Kinda, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And this particular one, it inserted itself into a gene called TBXT.
Okay.
And that gene, well, it's thought to be involved in the development of our tails.
Wait, so this genetic insertion might be why we lost our tails.
That's the idea.
Mm.
And here's the connection to bipedalism.
Mm-hmm.
Some scientists think that losing the tail could have indirectly made it easier or more advantageous to walk upright.
I never would have thought about that, but it kind of makes sense.
It's like evolution is all about these unexpected connections.
It's amazing how this tiny change in our DNA could have the huge impact on our physical form.
Tiny changes can have massive consequences, that's for sure.
Okay, so we're walking upright, no tails. And the next big leap forward in human evolution seems to be the brain, right? It gets much bigger over the last couple of million years.
Huge increase in brain size, yeah.
Yeah.
And generally, a bigger brain means, well, more brain power.
Smarter.
Right. Better at problem solving.
Mm-hmm.
Social interactions get more complex. Tools become more sophisticated. All these things would have been huge advantages for survival.
But here's a curveball, and this is what I love about this stuff. It always keeps you guessing. Our own species, Homo sapiens, we actually see a decrease in brain size over the last 100,000 years.
It's true, it shrinks a bit, especially in the last 6,000 years.
So what's going on there? Did we get dumber?
No, not necessarily. It actually tells us something really important about intelligence, about how our brains work. It's not just about size, you see.
So it's about how it's wired up.
Exactly, the organization and efficiency of the brain. A smaller brain that's more efficiently wired might actually be more powerful, in a way.
That's fascinating. Okay, and this leads us to these things called human accelerated regions, HARs for short. These are stretches of our DNA that have changed really rapidly compared to other species.
Right, they're like hot spots of evolution, places where our DNA has been tinkering away, making us unique.
And what are they doing, these HRs?
Well, they don't seem to be creating brand new genes. Instead, they're like fine-tuning the activity of existing genes, especially those involved in brain development.
Oh, interesting.
Imagine it like an orchestra, right? The genes involved in brain development are the instruments. And HARs, they're not adding new instruments, but they're like the conductor.
Ah, they're controlling how the instruments play.
Exactly. They're tweaking how the genes are expressed, how they're turned on and off, how strong they are.
So they're controlling the volume and the timing, basically.
Precisely. And that changes the whole symphony, the whole complexity of the brain.
And then we have these human-specific genes like srgap to B and srgap to C. What are they up to?
Those guys are thought to be involved in neoteny.
Neoteny.
It's like, think of it as extending childhood, but for the brain.
Okay.
Specifically, it means that the human cerebral cortex, that's the outer layer of the brain, where all the higher-level thinking happens, it takes longer to develop in humans.
So we have longer childhoods for our brains.
In a way, yeah. And that extra time, it allows for more connections to form, for the brain to become more complex.
So basically, more time to learn and grow.
That's the idea. And that's thought to be a key reason why we have these advanced cognitive abilities.
It's like our brains are in school for longer.
Exactly. More time to study and become experts.
Okay, so we've got the walking, the big brains, and now humans start to spread out across the world. This is where the out of Africa hypothesis comes in.
Yeah, the idea that modern humans, Homo sapiens, we originated in Africa around 200,000 years ago.
And then we started migrating out less than 100,000 years ago.
Spreading across the globe, reaching every corner of the world.
And there was this other idea, the multi-regional origin hypothesis, right?
Yeah, but the evidence from genetics, it really points to out of Africa being the more likely scenario.
So we all came from Africa relatively recently.
Yeah, in terms of evolutionary time, it's very recent, although there were earlier hominins who left Africa before us, like way before.
Right, like 2 million years ago or even earlier.
Yeah, going into Asia and Europe. But the Homo sapiens migration, that was later.
And we kept going, didn't we? Reaching Australia around 60,000 years ago in the Americas, like 30 to 20,000 years ago.
Yeah, that's right. Humans are explorers by nature.
And as we explored, we encountered all these different climates, all these different environments. What did that do to our genes?
It put them to the test, that's for sure. It was like a giant natural experiment in adaptation.
Survival of the fittest, right?
Absolutely. In colder climates, we see a trend toward shorter stature and stockier bills, which helps conserve heat.
Like bundling up.
Yeah, exactly. And in those really extreme cold places, like Northern Asia and the Arctic, you see thicker facial fat, flatter faces.
Extra insulation.
Yeah, keeping warm and preventing frostbite. And some research even suggests slightly larger skulls in colder regions, maybe for a slightly larger brain.
To process all that cold weather information.
Maybe, who knows. But then you have the Australian Aboriginals in the central desert. They've evolved this incredible ability to lower their body temperature at night without shivering.
Wow, that's amazing.
An energy-saving trick, a way to survive in a harsh environment.
And then there's skin pigmentation, which is so obviously tied to sunlight.
Oh yeah, that's a classic example of adaptation. In places with less sunlight, lighter skin evolved.
To absorb more vitamin D. Right.
Exactly. And it's not just us. Neanderthals, they had those genes for lighter skin too.
They did.
Yep. And the specific mutations for light skin in Europeans and East Asians, those are relatively recent, probably after the last ice age.
So we're still adapting even now.
Always adapting, yeah. And then you have blue eyes. That's another light-related adaptation.
Right.
That genetic variation popped up around 14,000 years ago, somewhere around Italy and the Caucasus.
So blue eyes are a pretty recent invention, evolutionarily speaking.
Yeah, very recent. And then there's nose shape that's adapted, too, to different climates.
Oh, yeah, I've heard about that.
In hot, dry places, you see narrow noses. They help conserve moisture.
And in humid places.
Flatter, broader noses. Maybe for cooling the air, maybe for moisturizing it.
So everything is connected. It's amazing.
It is, isn't it? Like a giant puzzle, and the pieces all fit together.
And it wasn't just temperature and sunlight we had to adapt to. What about altitude? Moving up into the mountains?
Oh yeah, that's a whole other challenge. Less oxygen up there, so you have to adapt or you won't survive.
So how did we adapt?
Well, populations in places like the Tibetan Plateau, Ethiopia, the Andes, they've all independently evolved ways to cope with the thin air.
Like what?
Changes in their blood, for one.
Mhm.
They can carry more oxygen in their blood.
Like super blood.
Kinda, yeah. And some of these adaptations are quite recent, like within the last 3,000 years.
Wow, that's fast.
Evolution can work quickly when it needs to.
What about the Sherpas? They're famously good at high altitudes.
They are, and they actually got a little help from Denisovans.
Denisovans.
Yeah, another ancient human group. The Sherpas inherited this specific gene from them, EPAS1 it's called.
And what does that gene do?
It helps them breathe easier at high altitudes.
So we're not just adapting on our own, we're getting help from other human species.
It's all part of the story, this mixing and mingling of genes over time.
Okay, so we've adapted to the air, the temperature, now let's talk food. Our diets have changed so much over time, especially with the development of agriculture.
Oh yeah, food, that's a big one. And our genes have definitely been shaped by what we eat.
So what are some of the big changes?
Well, think about alcohol. The ability to break it down quickly, that became more advantageous as we started farming and producing fermented foods and drinks.
Like beer and wine.
Exactly. There's this gene, ADH1B, and a specific variant of it, an allele, that helps metabolize alcohol faster.
So people with that variant could handle their booze better.
And that might have been a real advantage, especially in places like southeastern China, where rice was domesticated early on and used to make alcoholic beverages.
So rice wine might have driven the evolution of that gene.
It's a possibility, and it shows how our culture, what we eat and drink, can actually influence our genes.
It's not just our genes shaping us, it's us shaping our genes.
Yeah, exactly. It's a two-way street, remember?
Yeah.
And then there's the salivary amylase gene, AMY1, that's another cool one.
I remember reading about that one. What's the story there?
So this gene produces an enzyme, salivary amylase, which breaks down starch in your mouth.
Starch, like in bread and potatoes.
Exactly. And, before agriculture, we weren't eating that much starch.
We were hunting and gathering.
Right. More meat and wild plants. But with agriculture, bang, lots of grains in our diet.
Rice, wheat, all that.
Yep. And guess what? People in populations with high starch diets tend to have more copies of the AMY1 gene.
So they can digest starch better?
It's an adaptation, a way to get more energy out of those starchy foods.
It's like evolution is tailoring our genes to match our diets.
It's remarkable, isn't it? And then, of course, there's lactase persistence, the ability to digest milk as adults.
Right, I can drink milk, but some people can't.
Normally, we lose that ability after we're weaned.
Weaning, like when babies stop breastfeeding.
Exactly. But in populations that domesticated cattle and started drinking milk regularly,
Pastoralists.
yeah, pastoralists, they evolved lactase persistence.
So they could keep drinking milk and get all that nutrition.
It was a huge advantage, especially in places where sunlight was limited and vitamin D was scarce.
Milk became a vitamin D lifeline.
It's a perfect example of how a cultural practice, dairying, can drive a genetic change.
And it happened independently in different parts of the world, right?
That's the cool part. It's convergent evolution. In Europe and in Africa, lactase persistence evolved, but through different genetic tweaks.
Two different solutions to the same problem.
Exactly. It's like evolution is a tinkerer trying out different solutions until it finds one that works.
And it wasn't just us humans who were adapting. Our domesticated animals were changing too.
Oh yeah, they were along for the ride, evolving right alongside us.
Like dogs, they were domesticated way before agriculture, but they still adapted to our changing diets.
They did. They show an increase in a gene that helps them digest starch. AMY2B, it's called.
So they were eating our scraps.
Probably. And those scraps were getting more starchy as we ate more grains.
It's like this co-evolutionary dance, us and our dogs adapting to each other.
It's a beautiful thing, this interconnectedness of life.
Okay, but it wasn't all sunshine and roses, right? As we migrated, we also encountered new diseases.
Oh yeah, diseases, that's a big part of the story too. And they've been a major force in shaping our genes.
Survival of the fittest again?
Absolutely. New pathogens, bacteria, and viruses, they were a constant threat.
And only the people with resistance survived.
Well, it's more nuanced than that. Sometimes it's about having a slightly better immune system. Sometimes it's about specific resistance genes.
Okay.
A classic example is the sickle cell anemia allele. 2 copies of this allele, you get sickle cell disease.
Which is a serious condition.
It is. But 1 copy, and you're actually protected against malaria.
Wow, so it's like a trade-off.
It is. It's called heterozygote advantage.
Mm-hmm.
1 copy is good, 2 copies are bad.
So it all depends on the environment. What's beneficial in one place might be harmful in another.
Exactly. It's all about context.
And then, of course, there's the agricultural revolution, which was a massive turning point in human history.
A game changer, for sure. Around 12,000 years ago, it all started in the Levant.
What was so revolutionary about it?
Well, for one, it meant settling down. No more nomadic life. We were farmers now.
Tending crops, raising animals.
Yeah, and that had huge consequences for our way of life, how we lived, how we interacted, and of course our genes.
We already talked about some of the dietary adaptations like the amylase gene and lactase persistence.
Right, those were big ones, but there were others too.
Like what?
Well, grains aren't as nutrient-rich as some wild foods.
So we have to adapt.
We did. Our genes changed to improve our ability to absorb nutrients from grains, like ergothioneine.
And the alcohol metabolism gene, that probably got a boost too, right?
Probably, yeah. More farming meant more fermented foods and drinks.
So it wasn't all good news.
No, not at all. Settling down brought new challenges.
Like what?
Diseases spread more easily in crowded communities.
Oh yeah, close quarters.
And living with animals. Yeah. That introduced new pathogens.
Makes sense.
So our immune systems had to adapt. We needed better defenses.
Natural selection in action.
Exactly. But there were also downsides to the agricultural diet.
Like what?
Malnutrition, for one. Not enough of the right nutrients.
I can see that.
And more cavities because we were eating more carbs.
Sugar feeds bacteria.
It does. And there's even evidence that early farmers had weaker bones than hunter-gatherers.
Wow, really?
Yeah, it's kind of a paradox, right? More food, but not necessarily better health.
So agriculture was a mixed bag, genetically speaking.
It was a trade-off. More stability in food, but new challenges to adapt to.
Okay, so we had the big out of Africa migration, but that wasn't the end of the story, right? Humans kept migrating.
Oh yeah, we're a restless species, always on the move.
And those later migrations, they continued to shape our genetic diversity.
Absolutely. Think of it like this. You have a big group, and a small group splits off and goes somewhere new.
Okay.
That smaller group, they only carry a subset of the genes from the original group.
So they're less diverse.
Exactly. It's called the founder effect. And then there's genetic drift. That's random changes in gene frequencies in small populations.
So it's like chance plays a role, too.
A big role, especially in small, isolated groups. And generally, the further you get from Africa, the less genetic diversity you find.
Because the original migrations were from Africa.
Right. And each subsequent migration, it's like a branching out with less and less diversity as you go.
But migration wasn't just a one-time thing. It's been happening constantly throughout history.
It's ongoing, yeah. People move, they meet, they mix.
And that leads to gene flow, right? Sharing genes between populations.
Exactly. Mixing the pot, so to speak. And that tends to make populations more similar genetically.
But then there's isolation, too, right? When groups are separated.
Right. Geographic isolation.
Yep.
That can preserve unique genetic traits.
Like islands.
Exactly. Islands are classic examples. But it can happen anywhere. There's a barrier, mountains, deserts, even cultural barriers.
And there have been some really big migrations in history that have left their mark on our genes.
Oh yeah, some massive ones. The Neolithic migrations, that was the spread of agriculture across Europe and Asia.
A wave of farmers.
And their genes, yeah. Then there's the Indo-European expansion. That one spread languages and genes across a huge swath of Eurasia.
And more recently, the Great Atlantic Migration that brought millions of Europeans to North America.
Huge influx of genetic diversity.
And of course, the transatlantic slave trade, that had a profound impact on the genetic makeup of the Americas.
A tragic and forced migration with lasting consequences.
So it's not just about where we came from, it's about all the movements and mixing that have happened since then.
It's a complex tapestry, woven over thousands of years.
Okay, so we've been talking about gradual changes, adaptations to climate, diet, all that. But what about the big, sudden events in history, the catastrophes?
Those have shaped us too. Left their mark on our genes.
Like what?
Well, pandemics, for one. Those are major selective events.
Survival of the fittest, again?
In a way, yeah. Think about the Black Death, the bubonic plague.
That was devastating.
It wiped out a huge chunk of the population. And those who survived, well, they likely had some genetic advantage, maybe a stronger immune system.
So the Black Death changed the gene pool.
It did, and it wasn't just the Black Death. Smallpox, the Spanish flu,
Yeah.
COVID-19, they've all had an impact.
And those diseases introduced to the Americas by Europeans, they were devastating too.
They were. And part of the reason they were so deadly is that Native Americans had no immunity to them.
So their genes hadn't had a chance to adapt.
Exactly. And that's a reminder that genetics is about history, too, about the encounters between different populations.
And then there's war, which has been, sadly, a constant throughout human history.
Another source of trauma and death, and that can have genetic consequences, too.
How so?
Well, for one, massive loss of life can alter the frequencies of genes in a population.
Just by chance, who survives and who doesn't.
Right. But there's also the impact of trauma, the stress of war.
That can affect people for generations.
It can. And it can even leave marks on our genes through epigenetic changes.
Epigenetics, that's changes to how our genes are expressed, right?
Exactly. It's not a change to the DNA sequence itself, but it's like adding a sticky note to a gene, telling it to turn up or down its activity.
And those sticky notes can be passed down to our children.
Some of them can, yeah. It's still a new area of research.
Yeah.
But it's fascinating and a bit scary, too.
So war can literally leave scars on our DNA.
In a way, yeah. It's a reminder that our experiences, even traumatic ones, can become part of our biological inheritance.
And what about natural disasters? They can be just as devastating as war.
Oh, yeah, earthquakes, floods, volcanic eruptions. They can reshape entire populations, genetically speaking.
How so?
Well, imagine a disaster wipes out a large portion of a population.
Oh, okay.
That's a bottleneck. It suddenly reduces the genetic diversity.
Only the survivors can pass on their genes.
Exactly. And that can lead to big shifts in gene frequencies just by chance.
So a disaster can shuffle the genetic deck.
It can. And there's also the impact on the survivors themselves.
Trauma, stress, all that.
Right. And that can have long-term health consequences, maybe even changes to gene expression and accelerated aging.
So it's like a double whammy, the immediate impact and the long-term genetic changes.
It is. And sadly, natural disasters often hit developing countries hardest.
They're more vulnerable.
They are, in terms of infrastructure and resources. And that means the genetic consequences can be more severe, too.
Okay, let's switch gears a bit and talk about genetic diseases. They've been a part of the human story for as long as we've been around.
They have, and our understanding of them has come a long way.
From ancient observations to modern genetic testing.
It's been quite a journey. In the early 20th century, Mendel's work on inheritance was rediscovered.
The pea plant experiments.
Yeah, those. And that laid the foundation for modern genetics. And then you had researchers like Archibald Garrett. He started linking specific diseases to genes.
So he was one of the first to connect genes to disease.
He was a pioneer. But even centuries before that, there were descriptions of hereditary conditions like hemophilia.
Hemophilia, that's the bleeding disorder.
Yeah, and there's a famous case of it in European royalty.
Queen Victoria.
Where she was a carrier,
Yeah.
and it spread through her descendants, affecting several royal families.
It's a reminder that genes can have a real impact on history.
They can, and sometimes in unexpected ways.
Yeah.
There's also the Habsburg jaw, that distinctive chin in the Habsburg dynasty.
From all the inbreeding.
Yeah, marrying close relatives,
Yep.
which increases the chances of passing on harmful recessive genes.
And that jaw, it might have contributed to the downfall of the Spanish Habsburgs.
Some historians think so. Charles II, the last Habsburg king of Spain, he had a severe case, along with other health problems.
It's a reminder that genetics isn't just about individuals, it's about families and even entire dynasties.
It's a story that unfolds over generations.
And from an evolutionary perspective, it's interesting that some genetic diseases persist, even though they're harmful.
It is, and it goes back to that idea of heterozygote advantage.
One copy of a bad gene can sometimes be good.
Exactly. Sickle cell anemia, that's a prime example. One copy protects against malaria, 2 copies cause the disease.
So it's a delicate balance.
It is, and many of the gene variants that increase our risk for diseases, they're actually quite recent, evolutionarily speaking.
So we're still adapting to our modern environment.
We are, and sometimes our past adaptations can become liabilities in the present.
Like our love of sugary foods.
Exactly. It was great for surviving famines in the past, but now it's leading to obesity and diabetes.
So studying genetic diseases isn't just about finding cures, it's about understanding our evolutionary history.
It's a window into our past, and it can help us predict our future.
Okay, let's talk about the genetic revolution. Things have been moving so fast in this field.
Oh yeah, it's been an explosion of knowledge thanks to advances in DNA sequencing.
We can read our entire genome now faster and cheaper than ever before.
And that's opened up a whole new world of understanding.
So what have we learned?
Well, for one, it's confirmed the out of Africa theory with even more detail.
So we're all Africans, under the skin.
Essentially, yeah.
Yeah.
And it's revealed how complex those migrations out of Africa were.
Multiple waves, different routes.
It wasn't just one straight shot. It was a series of journeys and encounters.
And we've also learned about interbreeding with other human species, like Neanderthals and Denisovans.
Yeah, we carry a bit of them within us in our DNA.
It's like a genetic souvenir of our ancient past.
And ancient DNA, that's been a game changer too.
Extracting DNA from fossils, right?
Yep. And it's allowed us to reconstruct migration routes, figure out relationships between ancient populations, and identify genes that were important for survival in different environments.
It's like time travel, but for genes.
It is, in a way.
Yeah.
And it's constantly rewriting our understanding of the past.
And all this knowledge is leading to incredible advancements in biotechnology.
Oh yeah, we're at the cusp of a new era in medicine and beyond.
Like gene therapy, that's becoming a reality now.
It is, treating and even preventing genetic diseases.
And gene editing with CRISPR, that's revolutionary.
It is. We can literally rewrite our DNA now with incredible precision.
So what are the possibilities?
Preventing diseases, extending lifespan, personalized medicine tailored to your unique genes, it's all on the table.
And artificial intelligence, that's playing a big role too, right?
It is, helping us analyze all that data, developing new drugs, and even predicting health risks.
It's like science fiction is becoming reality.
It is. But with that power comes responsibility.
Right, the ethical implications are huge.
We have to think carefully about how we use these tools, about unintended consequences, about fairness and access.
It's a new world, and we need to navigate it carefully.
It is a world where we have the power to shape our own evolution, for better or worse.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, it's clear that our genes are this incredible record of the human story, this long and winding journey.
They are. They tell a story of adaptation, resilience, and interconnectedness.
From those first steps towards walking upright, to the expansion of our brains, to our global migrations and encounters with new environments, new foods, new diseases.
Our genes have been shaped by every step we've taken, every challenge we've faced.
And the diversity we see in human populations today, that's a reflection of all those adaptations.
It's a testament to the power of evolution to mold us to our surroundings.
And it's amazing to think that our DNA carries echoes of those ancient migrations, the pressures of past diseases, even the scars of trauma.
It's all there, written in our genes, waiting to be deciphered.
And now, with the genomics revolution, we have the tools to read that story, to understand our past in ways we never could before.
And with biotechnology, we have the potential to write the next chapter, to shape our genetic future.
But we have to do it wisely, with careful consideration of the ethical implications.
It's a powerful responsibility, one that we all share.
So as we leave you with this, we want to leave you with a question, something to ponder.
What will our genetic legacy be?
What future events, natural or human-made, will leave the biggest mark on our genes, and how will we use our newfound power to shape our genetic destiny? It's a lot to think about, and that's the beauty of it all.
The story continues, and we're all part of it.
Thanks for joining us on this deep